Jumpin' In on Manx Radio.
With Howard and Chris Kane.
Hello.
Good evening.
And welcome. And here we are once again on a Friday evening on Manx Radio, the best in modern and contemporary jazz, alternating with our sister programme Sweet and Swing. But this evening it is Jumping In with myself, H.
And me, Chris. Yes, welcome along to this week's show. And although you still may have chocolate, unlikely, Easter holidays are over, so before you know it, there'll be bikes everywhere and the TT will be here. Then it's the summer holidays, then we can start the countdown to Christmas. No, I'm not wishing the year over. Of course, the summer means jazz festival season, and we're going to see what we can do with regards to visiting a couple. But anyone with children knows that their lives seem to revolve around terms. But as the exams are still a few weeks away, you can put your feet up for the next hour or so as we bring some of the best new jazz around. So, H, what's been on the syllabus for you this week, and what's been worth studying in depth, and what's had you hot and cross other than your buns?
Well, I'll keep it simple. I've got a couple of birthday boys, and I'll be doing some unfolding with an orchestra.
Yeah, and from me, while we watch flickering lights, we have a sweet tooth, we get the green light for go, and we get things rolling. We look out at the lay of the land from Mike Holliber and the Gotham Jazz Orchestra. Lay of the Land there, the opening track from a recently released double album from pianist, composer and arranger Mike Holliber and the Gotham Jazz Orchestra. The album is called This Rock We're On, Imaginary Letters, and it draws inspiration from the natural world and the insights of various environmental writers, activists and artists. The extended suite features a fantastic Gotham Jazz Orchestra with numerous guests, including Chris Potter on tenor on the track we just heard, and the pieces alternate between instrumentals and imaginary letters in the form of songs, these written and performed from up-and-coming Brazilian vocalist Jamil Stevie Ayres. The suite itself is a delight from start to finish, can really swing hard as you heard, and has some ballads and quiet sections to contract. Soloists include Jason Rigby, Ben Kono and Charles Pillow on saxes, Marvin Stamm on trumpet, Jared Schoenig, really up-and-coming drummer, on the drums, Nia Felder on guitar, Jody Redhausch-Ferber on cello, James Shipp on vibes, as well as Chris Potter, who we heard, and bassist John Patitucci on selected tracks. Look out for it.
Indeed, cracking stuff. Enjoyed that very much, Lee. Great way to get going. I'll the first of my birthday boys now. A birthday boy sadly no longer with us, but a lot of his music still is, and still, I think, sounds, as we often say, fresh as paint, very modern, way ahead of his time. This is Jimmy Giuffre, the clarinetist, who sort of pioneered in many ways the free-form style of jazz, which is, well, I suppose is very common and certainly has been used by a lot of players these days, or influences them. You often hear, and a lot of the music we play here quite often on Jumpin In, you'll hear, whilst we don't feature much completely free jazz, you often hear music which has elements of freeness in it. So it might be some composed, some improvisation, and then some pieces of free improvisation before coming back to something which is scored or a melody again. Jimmy, born in 1921, he died in 2008, almost on his birthday as well, actually, 26th of April, so tomorrow would have been his birthday. And we're going to go back to 1961 on his classic album Free Fall, in the company of the great pianist Paul Bley, and I'm glad to say still with us, the man with the best eyebrows in the business. Lovely chap as well. We've met him and spoken to him a few times, though sadly never had a chance to interview him, but on, I think, upright bass in this case, more known for his electric bass work these days, Steve Swallow. And this track is called 3 We. still sounds really modern and spiky and different and completely contemporary. Jimmy Jufrey, Freefall, recorded in 1961. Steve Swallow bass, Paul Bley on the piano, of course. Paul no longer with us, sadly, but like I said, Steve Swallow still playing very well indeed in all sorts of different settings. And recorded in 30th Street in New York. I like this line in the liner notes. An engineer, he says, given this trio a great studio on 30th Street in New York, an engineer with radar ears and safe-cracking fingers, Fred Plout, a producer who hears and feels the music from the vantage point of a composer, Teo Massaro. And says, given the urge to enter new realms, glimpse other dimensions and reach the absolute, and the urge to enter new realms and find new visions. And yes, there's all sorts of great quotes of gravity, monk, electricity, time, space, the microcosmos, chemistry, gods, white-hot heat, asteroids, love, eternity. Yes, you get it. It's well, you need to read the liner notes to make sense of it all, if you can. Suffice to say, I still really enjoy it. It's like a real palate cleanser, I think. Jimmy Jufrey, Freefall from 1961. First of all, birthday boys.
Of course, there was still melodic music with Jimmy Jufrey as well. Famously, the Train and the River, of course. Next up for me, a new release which is not so much spiky as different, as continuing in the same vein, and none the worse for that as it continues to expand upon the music that has gone before with the same trio, pianist Eyolf Dale, with his new release on Edition Records, When Shadow Falls. When Shadows Dance, I beg their pardon. Here's the title track. Very good indeed, When Shadows Dance. Whilst carrying on in the same vein as Wayfarers from 2023, I think this trio goes from strength to strength, aided in no small measure by who Eyolf describes as the fourth member of the band, the fantastic acoustic of the Oslo Concert Hall, where the recording took place. Just as a studio, there was no audience there at the time. Whilst regularly changing musical partners can undoubtedly bring excitement to music, there is no replacement for familiarity, I think, in small units such as the piano trio. And the long-term partnership of Dale and his fellow Norwegians, Per Zanussi on bass and Auden Cleve on the drums, fosters a kind of telepathic empathy that is displayed here. When Shadows Dance, an essential edition release for me.
Marvellous stuff. Auden Cleve, of course, drummer on the Blue album with Tia Ripdahl, which I didn't like at the time, but it got a lot of critical acclaim, and I actually bought it sometime later. It was quite sort of rocky, and I've listened to it again more recently, and I probably enjoy it more than I did 15, 20 years ago. You're listening to Jumpin In with Chris and myself, H, here on Max Radio, and a new name for me now, Wilhelm Bromander. Yeah, you know him? I don't know. Wilhelm Bromander and his Unfolding Orchestra, the Swedish-based bassist and composer, brought out the first critically acclaimed album with what is now known as the Unfolding Orchestra. I don't think it was in the first album, the debut album in 2023 called In This Forever Unfolding Moment, hence the title, I think. And now he's following it up with an album called Jordan V. Evde, The Earth We Inherited, which is out this very day, April the 25th, 2025. And from that, we're going to hear a track dedicated to Mr. Redman, just called For Dewey. Yeah, that's cleaned your ears for you, isn't it? Very fine indeed. Not, like I said, a name I knew, neither the orchestra nor the leader. Wilhelm Bromander and the Unfolding Orchestra, out on a CD, LP, and of course downloads today. And thanks very much to Jim Johnson, by the way, from Ampersand, sending that through to us. As always, thanks, Jim. Always most appreciate the music coming through. A mixture of, well, yeah, I recognise it is true. I think if you've ever listened to Charlie Hayden's Liberation Music Orchestra, I can hear some of that in there, as is mentioned in the notes. Also, the politically charged folk jazz sound of the music of Carla Bley, which, of course, again, fed into Charlie Hayden's Liberation Music Orchestra, as well as her own music. Also influenced, which I'm not so familiar with, as quoted in one of the press releases, that the Drupad music, Indian Drupad music, which a quick Google tells me is a form of Hindustani classical music. Not so familiar with that at all. But like I said, the first album came out 2023 and was widely heralded, and I think won some awards. Wilhelm himself, a veteran presence, we're told, on the energetic Stockholm creative music scene. Still to get to Stockholm, I must admit, I'd like to go there someday, take a look. And we're told the eschews any divide between the pure expression in his music and the social activism of his personal choices. And the orchestra itself, well, again, I think he's another one of these players who, he is a veteran, but he loads his orchestra with a lot of young talent coming through. So Ellen Forkelid on tenor sax, Martin Kutchen on alto saxophone, Kat Hernandez on violin, and a whole scutch of others. I won't go through the whole crew there. The names probably won't mean a great deal to you, but all compositions and arrangements by Wilhelm himself, recorded just a year ago, just under a year ago, in fact, in June of 2024. And certainly, I think, a name to listen out for. And if you like sort of a free big band sound with that sort of political edge, I think, as well as something which has got something to say, that could be music you would like to check out.
Been on the scene in Stockholm for quite a while. A bass player, a session player, well-known session player, plenty of quartet recordings as well, but yeah, interesting stuff. Another interesting and slightly experimental release from pianist and composer Gerald Clayton with Ones and Twos, his third release on the Blue Note label, and one that he says has a nod towards the dark art of turntablism, is that even a word, and rhythm matching, where the vibe can be matched to allow a practiced mixologist, another word I don't know exists, with the ability to keep a groove going, but we know what he means. To that end, should you have 2 copies of the vinyl, you can match the tracks 1 to 6 on either side, as they're both the exact tempo, have the same length of track, and the same sort of style, but are different. Hard to imagine. Some have more solos, some have more samples, but anyway, I've tried it by kind of semi-mixing 2 tracks together digitally, and it does work. But for now, we'll just stick with the 1 track. Here's Cinnamon Sugar. Cinnamon Sugar from the experimental Ones and Twos, a recent release from pianist and composer Gerald Clayton, with vibraphonist Joel Ross, flautist Eleanor Pinder-Hughes, trumpeter Marcus Hill and drummer Kendrick Scott, and all the post-production work done by Casa overall. An interesting idea, and certainly something you might give a try. And I know now, I remember a couple of years ago being taken along by a friend for a drink at a lounge club where people sit around wearing slacks and roll-neck sweaters, and they play light music and jazz and instrumentals, and there's a DJ doing that sort of stuff, so who knows?
I'm like the idea of a Rolex sweater. Is that a really, really valuable sweater?
No, a roll-neck sweater, not a Rolex sweater.
Oh, I like
you
it.
Bright young thing.
Ah, dear, wonderful. It is Jumping In with Chris and myself, H. Another birthday boy, and just a couple of days ago, he would have celebrated his birthday. The irascible, brilliant, ever modern and just sort of fresh-sounding Charles Mingus, born on the 22nd of April 1922. Sadly left us in 1979, so it would have been a good old age, what, 103, something like that, were he still around. But again, an awful lot of music still to enjoy, and I thought we would enjoy some of it now, particularly as our correspondent in Luxembourg had just been at Ronnie's to see the brilliant Mingus Big Band. Some fantastic sounds. I still haven't seen them live. I'll catch them at some stage. However, here they were at the Jazz Standard in New York, and this is Gun-Slinging Bird.
Hello, this is Katrine Windfeld from Denmark, and you're listening to the Manx Radio Jumping In with Chris and H.
There we go, bit of a double birthday celebration there for the great Charles Mingus, who would have been, I think, 103 if I'm right. 22nd of April 1922 he was born. Like I said, sadly passed away in Mexico in 1979. A fantastic bass player, composer, band leader, activist, pianist, author. If you tried reading his book, that's interesting reading. I'm trying to think of the name of it now, Beyond the something or other. I have read it at some stage, or certainly good chunks of it, and as you can imagine, it is spiky and fairly fiery and interesting, and one of the few jazz composers ever to have his liner notes written by a psychiatrist. Famously, was that The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, I think? He got his shrink to write the liner notes for the album, something along those lines. Wonderful stuff, and the music still sounds brilliant today. You just cannot go wrong with a Mingus album, or indeed the Mingus Big Band. So we had the Mingus Big Band keeping his music alive, still going strong, and like I said, playing at Ronnie Scott's only the other week. Love to have been there, and some of our jazz friends were lucky things. And
sadly,
fantastic sound.
Not us. Yes. You say he would be 103. The legendary saxophonist Martian Allen has only just released his
at 100.
At 100 years old. A member of the Sun Ra Orchestra, iconic saxophonist at 100 years old. His first debut
That's
album.
amazing. Following that, we had, by the way, the second one. I thought, seeing as it's two for the price of one, from Mingus the classic Mingus album of 1959, and a nice slowy there, just called Self-Portrait in 3 colours, and that's the album which brought in things like Better Get It In Your Soul, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, Fables of Phoebus, etc, etc.
You can't go wrong with any of them, truthfully. Well, that's about it for this week's show, and indeed for April. Can you believe it? We're into May. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more of the same, but different, of course. But before we go, there's time for a track from Darren Pickering's Small World 3, which comes out as a digital-only release with CD print on demand on New Zealand's Rattle label. I have featured the previous albums on before, and I've enjoyed both of them, I have to say. 3 continues to tantalise with further subtle integration of a modern piano quartet, but with modular synths, giving an almost cinematic feel, and sometimes a feel of Matheny, sometimes a touch of EST, but always Small World, being Darren Pickering on piano, synths and modular, Heather Webb on guitars, Pete Fleming on bass, and Jono Blackie on the drums. Here's Green Blinking Light. See you in a couple of weeks.
You'll be good now.
Bye for now.